All right, I see the participant list populating, so I'm delighted to get started. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm really glad to have all of you with us today for this webinar. Our title today is Global Infodemic, which I hope caught the eyes of all of you when you registered. And this is a discussion about disinformation which has its roots in perhaps in pandemic times or before, and its modern manifestations. We see this as we confront the global instability arising from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and in a host of other areas. So for both Germany and the United States and the transatlantic community, this is a crucial issue to grapple with, to try to defuse and neutralize. And I'm delighted that we've got such a great lineup of people here to help us understand this better and perhaps also to map out a way forward. I am going to turn the gavel over to my colleague, Liz Hoteri, who is in front of our nicely branded wall, and Liz is going to guide us through the proceedings. And with that, Liz, over to you, and I look forward to hearing the conversation.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It is a real pleasure to have Tobias Hopp and Matthias Kettemann with us today. Tobias is an associate professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and his research focuses on issues related to mis- and disinformation, online political expression, and political knowledge. His scholarly work has appeared in multiple outlets and journals, and he is also the co-founder of a startup organization that uses artificial intelligence to identify news content at scale, and he received his PhD from the University of Oregon. And Matthias Kettemann is professor of innovation, theory, and philosophy of law, and is head of the Department for Theory and Future of Law at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. He is head of the research program on private communications at the Leibniz Institute for Media Research and the Hans Bredau Institute in Hamburg, and he leads research groups on international law and the internet and on platform governments at the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society in Berlin and the Sustainable Computing Lab at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. So we're so pleased to have both of you here today. If at any point any of our attendees have questions for our two panelists, please submit them in the Q&A function. And once we get to our discussion, I will submit those to our panelists. But for now, I'd like to hand it over to Tobias Hopp.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you all today. As was mentioned, for the last probably 5 or 6 years, my research efforts have dealt specifically with topics related to information consumption habits and how we can convert what we consume into knowledge and ultimately things like civic action and behavior. On the specific topic of so-called fake news, I think we're all aware that there's been a fairly significant definitional debate surrounding these terms and the way we describe this social phenomena since at least 2016. Obviously the Trump presidency in the United States brought a lot of this to the forefront, but there were these debates that about the types and quality of information that we are consuming and how those types and quality of information affect other aspects of our political and civic life. From my perspective, I see issues with how we've approached defining this phenomena. And these issues extend beyond the sort of pedantic things that scholars like I and Matthias do in our sort of academic work. And so we can see that there's an intense amount of politicization around this term fake news. It's used as a cudgel in some ways. It's used to delegitimize news that's produced under the traditional objective norms that we see in the US and in Western Europe. We see the terms mis and disinformation used including in the title of this webinar. And these are presented as sort of a alternate way to addressing the phenomena or describing the phenomena. And yet these definitions rely heavily on communicator intent. So disinformation is defined very specifically as information that is spread with an intention to harm others or to achieve political objectives via the use of falsehood. But as we know from a long line of thinking around topics like libel, it's very difficult to truly understand communicator intent. We also see terms like pseudo and junk news and other alternatives. Arriving at some sort of operational definition is, of course, critical for the public, for regulators, for scholars, for anyone that's interested in public life. And while I don't have explicit, even though it sounds like I don't have explicit problems with these prior definitions, but I do think that they fail us in one key way, and that is that they don't necessarily address these information providers as a category of producers of bits of information. And we therefore lose out on the ability to really assess where these information providers exist in the broader information ecosystems within which we all reside. So my working group, which comprises of my colleagues here at CU Boulder, but also increasingly folks in the Scandinavian countries, have started to coalesce behind this term called counter media. And we use this term for a number of reasons. First, it avoids sticky discussions or debates around truth. Who gets to define truth? What is truth? This is something that we've talked about for a very, very long time. Over the course of human civilization, truth is and will always be contested, and we'll always have questions about who has the right to declare something true or not. And I think when we talk about fake news, we're oftentimes talking about things that are not true. And in many cases, you see these bits of these media artifacts that are in fact untrue. But the broader problem and the bigger problem relates to information that has elements of truth, but is being presented in a slanted, biased, hyper-partisan type of way to achieve certain political outcomes. And so when we think of, and also when we talk about counter media, we're not necessarily engaging with these individual questions of communicator intent. Is someone seeking to hurt someone else or not? Those are important questions, but ultimately unanswerable from an external other. It's very difficult for me to understand whether someone is being genuine or not, whether someone's acting in good faith or not. I mean, I have my suspicions, but in terms of provability, there's a challenge there. And so we define counter media as types of informational outlets that seek to provide alternative renderings of reality that deviate specifically from the renderings of reality that we see produced by the mainstream news. The mainstream news, as I'll mention here in a moment, operates under certain standards and norms, norms of objectivity, so on and so forth, that aren't accidental. These are a sort of compromise that news organizations in the US and Western Europe have adopted in order to serve as sort of the primary injector of information into the public sphere. And when you think about counter media, then we're thinking about sites that, or typically online news sites, or online, informational sites, but they can exist in other realms as well, that seek to provide a different way of looking at thinking about things. And typically these are aligned with some political project, be it a party level project, a national project, so on and so forth. And so one example of what I might describe as a counter media site might be the RT properties. So formerly Russia Today, now RT.com, or under various similar hyperlinked addresses, depending on national context. Many lists might, we see these fake news lists out there, they might classify RT.com as a fake news provider. But I think it's worth pointing out that the vast majority of information that's produced and provided by the RT properties is actually produced in a way that is concordant with or in agreement with traditional standards of journalistic objectivity. That doesn't mean that RT is objective in nature. RT explicitly serves a function for the Russian Federation to advance its goals in Western Europe and in the US. And so if we're saying, Russia Today isn't necessarily fake news, the vast majority of stuff that's published by RT is not outright lies. It's instead slanted. There are issues with information selection. So what stories are reported and what stories are not reported on. And so we can see that there's a coherence around the objectives, the political objectives, the geopolitical objectives for the Russian Federation, without resorting to the sort of sheer and muscular propaganda that Putin and the Russian government has in other places, including in Russia. And so when I think about counter media, I think about these types of entities which are otherwise hard to classify and define and place in the media ecosystem. I think that ultimately the long-term goal, the outcome that counter media as a broad category of types of media outlets seeks is the breakdown of journalistic authority in the public sphere. And I'll say this with a caveat: I don't think modern journalism is perfect by any extent. I made my career in part criticizing journalistic practices and norms, which I find to be antithetical to democracy. But historically, we've got this conjectural space, the public sphere, where we talk about things that are of interest, of importance, in the modern moment that we exist within, and we need, of course, those debates have to draw upon information, and historically that information has come from the mainstream news, at least in the post-war period in the US and Western Europe. And journalists are assigned this task of sorting information into various bins. There's a guy named Dan Hallett who talks about spheres, informational spheres, and we've got the sphere of deviance, where information that is not appropriate or does not otherwise need to be talked about in the public sphere, journalists put bad information into the bin. That could be lies, mistruths, et cetera, et cetera. Then we've got the sphere of consensus, where information that everyone agrees upon gets placed in. We don't need to talk about is the earth round. I mean, some people on Facebook think we might need to talk about it, but overall, I think the general consensus is that the earth is a round thing. And then we've got the sphere of legitimate debate, and that's the information that journalists, broadly speaking, and the organizations they represent have deemed appropriate and important for legitimate debate. Counter media seek to collapse all these spheres into one messy, unmanageable public sphere, in which debate is ultimately not productive and increasingly not possible. If there's too much going on, if there's all these sort of crosswise questions and sort of mistruths or politically slanted ideas, hyperpartisan ideas that don't have a basis in reality or are presented in such a way that become confusing for individuals to navigate in their discussions in the public sphere, we see a very unproductive space. And I think that we see this in the ways that counter media address issues, right? There's a heavy selection bias. The topics that are presented in a certain way. And my worry is, of course, that the public sphere suffers as a result. I think that there's a lot of factors that have led to this. I'd be more than happy to talk about those things in more depth as we go through the question and answer session. But I think that this is a good stopping point to kind of kick it over to Matthias, because his talk will deal with issues around regulation, what is and is not possible, how we create better and cleaner public spaces for debate. And I unfortunately do not have those answers, so maybe he does.
Thank you very much, Toby. And like you said, we will kick it over to the other side of the Atlantic to Matthias.
Thanks so much for having me. Wow, you've set the bar rather high. I'm not quite sure I'm going to give all the answers to all of the questions regarding disinformation. I do believe some people call it a wicked problem. A wicked problem is a problem that can't actually be solved. It can only be mitigated, or rather, its effects can be mitigated. And I believe that meets how I look at disinformation quite well. The problem with disinformation from a legal point is that very little of what we define as disinformation can be easily regulated. Sometimes disinformation contains lies, sometimes it contains truth. Both lies and truth are usually protected by freedom of expression. Free speech under the US jurisdiction is, of course, even more broadly understood than freedom of expression under the European Convention on Human Rights. But basically, lies are never a problem. In states, you can lie. So we cannot use the untruthfulness of a statement as a starting point for regulation. So what else can we use? We can perhaps look at the effect. Now that would be an interesting point, right? So we can ask ourselves, do we need to look at the impact that a certain piece of information has? But it is rather difficult to know exactly what kind of impact that piece of information has until it has had that impact. So that would be an ex post problem. You cannot regulate something which you don't know the effect of. So you start to see the problems that that we have to normatively frame state responses to disinformation. It's also not easy to look at the others and say, we prohibit certain actors from spreading information, because those actors might usually spread disinformation, because that would be an ex ante control of expression, which goes against the very foundation of what we understand as freedom of expression to mean. So from a purely normative point of view, it is difficult to find any approach that would allow for a for regulating freedom, for regulating disinformation in a way that doesn't violate constitutional guarantees. That's on the state level. So where are we at now in the 10th or so year after the disinformation crisis? Well, we have agreed that certain kinds of disinformation, which has obvious harmful effects, can be regulated. So, for instance, those disinformation, that kind of disinformation that includes clear threats, that includes clear and present a danger for individuals, like untruth in certain contexts of heightened emotions, where an untruth might lead to violence. These kind of untruths can be regulated through national criminal law. That is not the problem, but that still doesn't help us with the vast majority of disinformation. And that's why European states, and using Germany as an example, have for quite some time now taken a different approach to regulating disinformation, namely a paralegal approach. So not through the medium of law, but rather through political media. For example, European states have asked the European External Action Service to put together a unit called EU versus Disinfo that has been rather successful in debunking especially Russian state propaganda over the last years. If you go to their website, EU versus Disinfo, you will find a an impressive array of disinformation that goes back to 10 years ago. And they're debunking that. At the same time, European governments have started to invest more heavily into strategic communication. Strategic communication is active informational self-defense by, for instance, funding national foreign oriented media like the Deutsche Welle in Germany. Voice of America would be the American counterpart, BBC World Service, which by law has to focus on foreign rather than domestic communication. Another point is a review of the national cybersecurity strategies, which has happened in a number of European countries, to include information operations as cyber threats. So last year, for instance, the German Federal Office has issued a restatement on the applicability of international law to cyberspace and has underlined that information operations, especially in the context of elections, can be seen not only as an interference, but actually as an illegal act that influences that violates the the sovereignty of Germany, and that measures would be taken against anybody trying that. Obviously, the fear was before the last Bundestagswahl that there would be a heightened interest in information operators to influence the way that the elections went. So this is sort of two aspects we've seen already: criminal law for certain cases, strategic communication, and a review of how cybersecurity threats are seen to include information operations. But that leaves a huge part of disinformation unchecked or unaddressed yet, and that's the part that's influenced by social media, by platforms and their internal rules and their practices, their automated recommender systems, their automated content governance systems. And that is why over the last years, the European Union, Germany has been in the lead there, has pushed for more transparency over how those companies address disinformation. Now, if you look at the rather famous Network Enforcement Act, you will find nothing about disinformation there, because it only obliges companies to take offline illegal content. And again, disinformation is mostly not illegal. The vast majority of disinformation is not illegal. You will also not find disinformation as a prohibited category within the new Digital Services Act. But what you will find is are transparency obligations for platforms. They have to inform, especially in the Digital Services Act, which has now been agreed upon 2 weeks ago. You will find duties for platforms to inform the public about how they deal with disinformation, how they deal with information that potentially negatively impacts social cohesion, rights of others, public health. A great example would be how platforms deal with corona-related disinformation, for example. Under the DSA rules, they have to give a regular assessment of the risk they pose for social cohesion, for public health, for public safety. And again, I think this is a good approach, because it stops short of regulating disinformation by prohibiting it, which states, again, they couldn't do because they would meet constitutional they have constitutional constraints, which are necessary because we don't want states to over-regulate information exchanges. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the internal logics of platforms and the goals on which they have optimized their algorithms over the past a decade or so have not been sufficiently in line with public values, including, as I've mentioned, the protection of individual rights and social cohesion. And progressively, this is recognized, has been recognized by European states, and that's where sort of the energy to provide a more vigorous framework of rules under the Digital Services Act came from. Now, is that the last word on that matter? Quite certainly not. but it is at least, I think, a good approach to approach disinformation, not directly, but rather through the ways through which it's being amplified. We know that disinformation lives and works through the amplification dimension. It's not so much any specific piece of disinformation that's a problem. It's rather if that disinformation is then shared and not countered. So I think that countering disinformation beautifully illustrates how just looking at lawyers to produce laws is a bad idea. Modern normative scientists, like I would perhaps count myself among them, look at laws basically as the last resort. For prohibiting something is never, neither the best first nor often the best last idea. And disinformation, I think, shows us how you can much more effectively fight a problem by looking at the realities of how that problem is being amplified. And I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. We can only solve that in a transatlantic perspective. So great that we can discuss this here in this setting.
Okay, thank you both so much for these very, very interesting presentations. I want to remind the audience to please use the Q&A function to submit any questions that you have to Toby and Matthias. I wanted to go ahead and get started though, and this is directed to both of you. Matthias, you mentioned strategic communications as a way to counter misinformation, from the European Union. Germany looked at that, encountering coronavirus, misinformation, disinformation. But is that really where we should be focusing our efforts, especially for people who maybe seek out alternative forms of information, seek out counter media because they don't support or don't trust the mainstream media in Germany and the United States? And I was also wondering, I think, in the US, there's a lot of, especially, with Trump saying that the mainstream media is the one that is the fake news, is that such a problem in Germany and Europe as it is in the United States? So that'll kick us off. Maybe, I don't know if one of you wants to start. Matthias, go ahead.
Sure, no problem. So the good thing about public service media in Germany, and the numbers are similar in France and in Britain, is that there's a high level of trust in traditional media. There's a big report called the Reuters News Study that does an annual survey of media usage, media repertoires, media trust, and they come to, at least with regard to a number of European states, to the result that during the Corona crisis, trust in traditional media, in what you call mainstream media, has actually improved. Especially because a lot of traditional media is now being slightly more new media savvy, so they have adopted some of the media. German public television has now a Telegram channel, and yes, it is definitely an issue. There are sort of counter publics. We have in Germany also our variety of sort of militia movements in a certain way, the Reichsbürger, but the basic level of trust in media, in traditional media, is, I would argue, a bit higher than in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's absolutely right in terms of the comparing Western Europe to the US. We do see like a recursive nature to this trust problem that we have here. It's been a long-standing political project, at least dating back to Nixon, to delegitimize the press in the US. And when we see delegitimization of the press in these sequences, there's a bit of a feedback loop there. And so I'm not sure how to break that feedback loop, especially because there's a political party that finds it in its best interest to push people away from mainstream or traditional reporting. I think if we're talking about, misinformation or disinformation, we have to think about the incentives that exist behind its production, whether those are incentives that are expressed by the platforms. So the platforms have an interest in time on site type goals. Individual producers of this information have political incentives, but they also have financial incentives that are obtained via this sort of vast network of advertising fraud, which is something that really floats a lot of this stuff, and is something that, if we were so inclined, we could address through regulation. This act, a characteristic act, I think, when it comes to digital advertising, of fraud that doesn't really have anything to do with speech, but has been used by malicious actors in a way to continue their enterprises.
There, I thought everything was speech.
And I mean, that kind of builds on, Matthias, your last point, and maybe transatlantic cooperation. Do you see a transatlantic solution to, maybe moderating how platforms amplify misinformation? Do you think maybe that would have to come from Europe? Because, in the United States, maybe lawmakers would be more interested in not regulating potential political donors from the platforms. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, it's my understanding that especially donations are also protected speech, right? So it would be difficult to have a constitutionally sound way to stop that. Also, I do tend to think that a lot of the European approaches to regulation might not work terribly well in the US. One of the reasons would be that there's a very strong, protection of both well, there's a strong protection from government regulation of speech in the widest sense, and that includes the internet, which has been extremely beneficial, for the growth of the internet to what we have it now. It might be a tiny bit less beneficial right now. What we do see is that some normative approaches can get taken up. I'm thinking of, for instance, the global, the General Data Protection Regulation, which now has been one of the sources of inspiration for the California Consumer Privacy Bill. So I think some ideas are not, they're not actually European; they're more global. The Santa Clara Principles on content moderation, for instance, are basically saying the same thing as the Digital Science Act does in a lot of ways, right? So I'm not sure that, saying the one thing that Europe does probably, what's easier is that there's this drive now to regulate platforms, and I think the majority of parties agrees sort of in the way that this regulation should be going. And it's my understanding that in Congress, while both parties are saying that something should be done, the something about which something should be done is not quite the same.
Thanks. Toby, anything to add on that?
Well, I think, the other element here is that the US suffers from almost complete, on the federal level, regulatory capture. Germany and the EU regulators are at least nominally interested in protecting the public good. I think it's hard to look at the behavior of regulatory agencies, at least on the federal level in the US over the last 2 decades, and argue that there's been centrally an interest in the public good that has guided much of the sort of regulatory behavior that we've seen. And maybe that's a bit cynical, but to me, that's kind of the facts on the ground.
All right, and we have a question from Jeff Rathke. So he says the EU has banned Russian counter media such as RT and Sputnik, and a number of privately owned platforms have also taken measures against these media. This is not new. A number of countries have acted on a national basis in the past to prevent the broadcasting of content deemed as disinformation. What is the evidence from those earlier experience about their effectiveness, for example, in some of the Baltic countries or in Ukraine before the war?
So I don't think there's a lot of hard evidence that banning specific media outlets has a clear effect. One of the reasons would be that it's difficult well, it would be difficult to construct a case where you could measure that, right? I mean, it would have been a parallel reality where that ban hasn't happened. So that's a bit difficult. The EU ban on RT and Sputnik wasn't so much. I mean, I know that in the public discussion, EU commissioners mainly highlighted the disinformation aspect, but the legal basis was foreign policy, right? So it was a foreign policy measure. It was a sanction based on legally based on as a part of the European response to Russia's aggression. And independent of that, indeed, a lot of platforms acted partially before that already, partially motivated by the way that Russia treated them, and partially after Europe had banned those networks. Germany, for instance, RT has had a hard time even before, because they wanted to apply for a public television license, which they didn't get. Then they tried to do that via Luxembourg. That didn't work out. Then they tried to get one via Serbia, and the German authorities wouldn't accept that. So it's been an issue for quite some time. And I think that it makes sense to execute it. It makes political sense to do that. Legally, it was probably not the best move, and I don't think it would have had a substantial effect either way.
I think also that we're talking about a very sort of narrow group of media properties here. These state-owned media entities. And by banning them, which again makes political sense, especially domestically, I think we see that we open the door to retaliatory actions. And so now you might look at Russia and say, well, and maybe again, we don't have a counterfactual, maybe this would have happened anyway, but the average Russian citizen has no access to external media. So what have we really accomplished? Banning RT, I don't believe RT is particularly influential in the overall sort of public debates that we have. And we've also, by banning that, so what have we gained versus, has there been parallel actions to ban other sources of information?
Yeah, but then again, I also don't think we've lost a lot, So I think that's sort of the biggest thing happening. What I see as much more important is the informational dimension of this war, which has been completely different from other conflicts in the past, right? So the way that the war is present in a lot of in media, also through the highly digitized Ukrainian population, manages to use social media to show the horrors of the war in a way that hasn't happened in wars in Syria, in Yemen, because there has to be some explanation why suddenly there are those sanctions, a lot of sanctions, global outcry. And there was little of that during the war in Syria, during the war in the ongoing war in Yemen, or after the Crimea invasion. What is fundamentally, yes, there are some differences, of course. The violence is different, but legally it was the same. It was also a violation of Ukrainian sovereignty, but states didn't react quite in the same way. But that leads us a bit away from the topic of disinformation. I understand that.
Matthias, I just had a quick question. In your presentation, you mentioned the German election in 2021 and how there was a lot of worry about disinformation campaigns that would influence voter behavior. Do you know if there's a widespread evidence of that, or if perhaps there was a robust enough mitigation strategy, or perhaps it just wasn't as big of an issue as people thought it would be?
We've had such a beautiful project, with lots of emergency things planned, and then luckily nothing big happened, So this was a very boring election when it comes to disinformation, which is fantastic, right? So so experts in disinformation should be bored, just like the best cancer researcher is one that doesn't have a job, right? So it worked out fine. That of course shouldn't leave us in a false sense of security, right? Disinformation can raise its ugly head from one minute to the next, and we're never quite safe from that. The one thing which perhaps helps is a combination of literacy, state measures at the boundaries, and a robust system inside of social media companies to make sure that disinformation, when it does get spread, has certain breaks, certain safety breaks.
And Toby, I also had a question about your presentation. You mentioned at the end sort of factors that have led to this environment of counter media. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about those factors.
Sure. I mean, obviously, we see the expansion of digital and social media, which allow, or are part of a broader story about media fragmentation. I think we also have to point out things related to the business decisions made by mainstream news organizations over the past 30 years, the market models that they've used, the inability to adjust to changing financial and operational realities related to the internet. I think there's been a lot of regulatory stresses and failures. That's to be expected. As Matthias has pointed out, these are very complex issues, and we're not going to be able to address some of them via state level regulation. I think you've seen a great deal of capital consolidation, especially in the US. You scratch the surface between a lot of these counter media entities and you find a billionaire, you find a Mercer, you find a Coke. I think we've seen a nationalization and globalization of politics. My little town just had an election and people were talking about things that had very little to do with my little town. And then also the behavior of political elites. As long as political elites see this as a part of campaigning, as a part of strategic messaging, they're going to use it. So there's an incentive and there's a reward for using these sort of shadowy means of communicating and modifying and producing messages. And so I think if we put all those together, we've got a situation that's perhaps ripe for what we might call low quality information around important political and social issues.
Okay, and to follow up on that, and this is maybe for both of you, could you say more about how you see the counter media landscape and techniques maybe evolving, how they could likely evolve both in Germany and Europe and in the US?
So there's a lot of media in Germany, no doubt about that. But as I've said before, there's a surprisingly high level of trust in mainstream media. You get values like 50-60% that would say that they trust public television, and you only get 15 to 20% of people saying they trust news they get from social media. There is a growing number of influencers that have migrated towards being information influencers. Especially the Corona pandemic has proven a fertile ground for people who are slightly unhappy with everything, and this this slight unhappiness with the status quo, socioeconomic fears coupled with a distaste perhaps of politics, or the status quo politics, distaste with the stratification of societies, increased mobility pressures. All of those things have coalesced towards, let's say, a certain readiness to accept counter narratives. Again, that question, hitherto undisputed collective beliefs, such as that the government is by and large knowing what they're doing, right? That's kind of an Austrian and German approach, that they kind of we might be boring, but at least the government's kind of doing its work. And there's now, I would argue, there's more pressure on the government to explain what they're doing, on media to explain what they're doing. People are watching more closely. So I would say that there's sort of a latent counter media, or a latent readiness to accept counter media narratives. I would say that's possible to say.
Yeah, and I think when you think about tactics, how they might change or shift, this is very much sort of a try a bunch of different things and see what works from these producers of this type of information. And so you'll see, there's going to be Reddit, there's like spaces on Reddit where people can organize, and those get shut down and they move to maybe a different place. And there's this sort of a maximalist type of pressure on our overarching informational systems. And you see breakthroughs here and there. And so I don't think that there's a coherent or grand strategy behind this penetration of the public sphere with counter narratives or counter knowledge, but rather a kind of exertion of pressure on all different fronts, and a contextual understanding of, in some cases, some things going to work, other things won't work, so on and so forth. So I think like the types of tactics that were powerful when it came to spreading, let's say, or to encouraging vaccine skepticism, were going to be very different than the types of things that we might talk about in electoral politics. And they actually have, slightly different constituencies. So the short answer is, I don't know what how these strategies or tactics will change over time, or if they will or even need to.
And do you think that governments are, attuned to kind of this maybe pressure to be more transparent in their decision making that you mentioned, Matthias, like to respond to this, kind of pushback against, especially what happened during the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, I would say so. We have a new government that is more media savvy, more open. We have a finance minister, for instance, the head of the Liberals, that just opens his phone and talks for 2 minutes about how exactly he's planning the German exit from dependence on Russian oil. That's quite a new and gas, quite a new approach to communication, which I think resonates a lot with younger people. I think one issue which we probably might have to mention also is that sort of when we're saying disinformation is bad, right? I think the bigger threat is also what you described as sort of this the bad information, right? Or what did you say? Low quality information, right? So the counter thing to plurality, to a democratic discourse space with many opinions, right? That should be kind of the goal, of course. And we have to ask ourselves, are we too focused on disinformation to forget about some of the conditions that can make such a communication space grow and flower, right? And if we want that, who is responsible for that? Is that something a government can do? That's difficult, but who else? Will it be something that communication space owners like like social media companies will do? Well, I have limited they have limited incentives to make a discourse space that is filled with honey flowers, good ideas, and happiness, right? So who's doing that then?
Right. And I guess, Toby, that feeds kind of into your research on media. Like, do you think it's not just governments that need to be cognizant of this, but do you think media companies, journalists are taking note of this new environment?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think part of the answer here is that journalism as an institution, at least in the US, needs to, reclaim a sort of muscular status in the public sphere. Our trust problem is hugely problematic in that regard. I don't think that news organizations have always thought in the long term. And I think that that's harming them, has harmed them, will continue to harm them. I mean, if we think about, we might call this the both-siderism problem of news journalism, when one party or actors within one party take a anti-democratic stance and you cover that and you provide a platform for that, well, that's hugely problematic, and you're using your abilities for amplification to kind of seal your own fate, at least in the US context. Part of the problem with social media companies, and we've talked about this, is they're not incentivized to actually ensure a type of coherency or public social good on their platforms. They're incentivized to keep people on those platforms as long as possible. I also think that they're not in control of their algorithms. One of the challenges with these recommender systems is that they're using these sort of black box algorithmic tools, these machine learning tools that are tremendously powerful from a computational perspective, but they're black box tools. We don't necessarily know what's going on inside of them because they're so mathematically complex. And they ultimately spit out a solution that speaks to, this incentivization of time on site. Well, what we find when people have negative emotions evoked and stimulated, they become interested. They become engrossed in content and content environments, and they're more likely to stay in those places. But is that good for people on the individual level? Is that good for government? So on and so forth. And it's good for the social media companies because they make money by selling advertising, and the longer that people are on these platforms, the more advertising that they can sell. There's a whole fraud issue in the background there, but ultimately we're not going to address this problem until we address incentives, and some of that, as I think Matthias points out, are material conditions that people exist within. And if those material conditions aren't addressed, usually, I would say by governments who are best equipped to address things around life expectancy and quality of life and so on and so forth. If those things aren't addressed, then you do have a situation in which that's sort of a fertile ground for accepting these counter narratives.
Just to add perhaps here, what I do agree with you that probably, and most computer scientists will agree with that too. It's extremely difficult to say with any degree of specificity how exactly any specific decision was reached by an algorithmic decision-making engine. I do think that platforms have a pretty decent picture of the effects that tweaks in the algorithm have. Otherwise they wouldn't implement them. So we know from from internal documents from Facebook, for instance, that they do a lot of research on how different tweaks to the algorithm affect their bottom line, and that they haven't always in the past chosen the tweak that leads to, let's say, societally and individually better results, but often the tweak or the change that led to, well, to a better bottom line. This is kind of one of the things which the DSA also addresses by forcing platforms to explain the logic of the recommender systems, right? I mean, if we say that it's bad that platforms optimize algorithms for for long use times or for engagement, then we have to ask ourselves, well, I mean, what do we want them to optimize their algorithmic engines for, And in order to be able to answer that question, we of course first need to, know a bit more about the status quo. That's why these transparency duties for recommender algorithms are, I think, a pretty decent idea. It's also something that's already contained in the General Data Protection Regulation, which allows anybody who is objected to a purely automated decision to be informed about the logic of the underlying algorithmic parameters. So, for instance, those famous cases of people who have whose recidivism rate was wrongly projected by algorithms in use by, for instance, Florida law enforcement. So they would have the opportunity to, to be informed about what kind of parameters go into that system. And I think we should know more about that generally also with social media. That could help us, for instance, design more effectively strategies against disinformation. Yeah.
I guess we won't go into what will happen when Elon Musk buys Twitter and releases the algorithm to everyone, like some people think. I don't see any further questions in the Q&A queue, so I think we can wrap it up here. I would like to thank our speakers for this really fascinating talk about the disinformation environment, the counter media environment, and challenges that we're both facing and potential solutions that we have to counter this movement. I want to thank Susanna Dieper, our Director of Programs and Grants, who manages this project, for putting this all together. I would also like to thank our sponsor, the Transatlantic Program of the Federal Republic of Germany, which is funded by the European Recovery Program at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And this event is part of a series we're doing on the importance of the transatlantic relationship in times of global crisis. We actually have a webinar tomorrow that will be talking about the intersection of public health policy, public trust, and how that affects not just in the pandemic, but our healthcare policy, our healthcare workers, in light of the erosion of trust in experts. And then finally, I would like to thank our audience for their interesting questions, for their attention, and I hope you'll join us next time. Thank you very much.